Delighted to have Dr. Kamran Asdar Ali with us, who is Dean of the Burmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Dr. Kamran Asdar was, before coming here, at the University of Texas, Austin, and was also the president of American Association of Pakistan Studies. He is one of the leading urban anthropologists who have studied Pakistan and Egypt. My own effort of forming a connection with him is that, like me, he also did MBBS before pursuing social science research through PhD. We are privileged to have him today, and without further delay, I open the forum for him.
Thank you, Dr. Asdar and other colleagues for inviting me. I just arrived this morning after almost a 36-hour flight from Austin, where I was visiting my family and also taking care of some business like 2 defenses and admissions and things like that, so, which never ends actually. When I've moved from the United States, but my US life starts at 6 because it's morning in America. This is no pun on Reagan's ad. So I sent a title, but which I'm sorry I don't have it here. I just have a map of Pakistan. But today I don't want to sort of bore you, because I'm sure between me and the evening are some snacks and food and that you've been waiting for. So hopefully, and there's an end of the conference ceremony as well.
It's a brief 10 minutes.
Okay. So let me start with some excerpts from a book by Azra Abbas, who's a poet and writer, a feminist writer. And in her book, Mera Bachpan, she depicts Karachi of a not-so-distant past and gives us a window into her early life. The book was published in '97. The narrative is filled with small rebellious acts by a young girl growing up in Karachi of the late 1950s, and who's trying to understand the world around her with all its ironies and contradictions. Told in short passages and paragraphs that sometimes have dreamlike sequences, the way memory works when recalled many years later, Bachpan shows us a world through a female child's eyes and emotions. A distinctive aspect of this memoir is the changing face of the city and the place of females in it. Abbas fondly remembers the dusty, unpaved street in front of her house, where she, along with other boys and girls from her neighborhood, would play marbles, fly kites, and how she would go to the cycle shop, rent a bike, and ride it for hours. This is Karachi of the 1950s, remembered by Abbas as a young girl. So this is late 50s, early 60s, in a Karachi where young girls could ride bikes, and even lower middle class neighborhoods of the city. However, as she grows older, the city outside changes. The unpaved streets get street lights. And Abbas' own life temporarily becomes more darkened as her movements are increasingly restricted to the house, with no more playing in the dusty road outside. So when Dr. Asdar asked me to share my views with all of you, I was perplexed about how to frame my talk, because I am trained as an anthropologist. The medicine is very far away, as it is for you now. I suppose you are a better doctor than I ever was, but of that kind, of this kind as well. One of the things I want to do in this paper is to show how cities, especially like Karachi, that are, excuse me, can you put those on back? Because I don't remember it. नहीं वो साइड बार जो था वो रहने दीजिए
अच्छा
शुक्रिया
ठीक
शुक्रिया शुक्रिया ये मेरे लिए है I'm
अच्छा
technically illiterate so
Okay.
please bear with me I apologize and so ठीक
ठीक है
okay, शुक्रिया so I basically wanted to say that despite the fact that cities like Karachi are represented as places of conflict and violence, there are also spaces of that we have to understand, or stories we have to tell ourselves, or stories that need to be excavated, and archives that we need to go to really think about how people also get along despite disagreements. What are the spaces of working together, of living together, of falling in love with the wrong ethnicity, of also quote-unquote getting along. So this heavy representation of conflict and violence needs to be tempered with how people, and this is happening here in Lahore as well. I haven't been here long enough. I used to live here as a child in the early 70s, and that Lahore in today's Lahore is very different. But you have a lot of immigration or migration from mostly rural Punjab, from small and large cities. A lot of your middle class and lower middle class neighborhoods are basically getting full. A lot of young people are coming in to get education. And there's a palpable anxiety in Lahore about the foreigners are coming. Not only foreigners, quote unquote, who speak your own language, which is Punjabi, but people, and there are, I'm sure, and I'm exaggerating with it, there are now 5 Pashtuns in this city and everyone is worried about the Pashtun invasion. Which is sort of the character of this city, which hasn't seen a certain kind of coming together of various ethnicities and people of languages and sectarian difference and religions as Karachi has for a while. In those terms, and I apologize to all of you, Karachi still remains the most important urban space in Pakistan because of this difference. Of course, it leads to conflict and contradiction. But Lahore will be facing similar kinds of problems. So in Karachi, where I grew up, there is a constant talk within my household and those of my middle class friends how in the 50s our mothers and aunts, that was one about Azra Abbas, but I'm still lingering over the 50s, our mothers and aunts would go to watch movies without chaperones. Actually, I don't know how many of you have read Intezar Hussein's Chiragh Par Dhua, he talks about how he and Hanif Rame passed away too, so venerated literary figure of Punjabi and Urdu, but also a politician. He was Chief Minister of Punjab in the 1970s. Would stand in the old Mall Road, which still had Arch Street, and sit by the side of the road and watch what he in Urdu says, chotiyan, which are braids. And he doesn't even say and he says chotiyan bicyclon pe. That's how Intezar Hussain talks about women going to the old campus. He can't even say the word women. In the entire book, there are only 2 women, एक जमीला हाशमी है और एक ज़हरा निगाह है. ना उनकी वालदा हैं उसमें. It's a very particular kind of a masculine text. But anyway, let me move on. Our mothers and aunts would go to watch movies without chaperones. They would wear saris showing their bare midriffs, less and less visible in the contemporary public space, and walk without hesitation through the elegant streets of downtown Karachi. Zeenat Hassam, a journalist and publisher and author based in Karachi, similarly remembers her childhood in early 60s. Hassam's text was published with a series of essays on Karachi and partially explores her childhood in the newly developing middle-class neighborhoods of Greater Karachi. She narrates how, as children, she could play with her siblings and cousins all afternoon near or away from their homes in the underdeveloped plots of the subdivision, and also venture far from their homes without any fear or hesitation. She depicts a Karachi of 1960s, a place of peace and tranquility, with fluttering butterflies, blossoming bougainvilleas, and fruit-bearing almond and tamarind trees all over. Now, this, if people are aware of Karachi, she's talking about Shaheed Millat Road and Hill Park and that area, which still was developing as a space, which is now, then became a very solid upper middle class neighborhood. Irrespective of Assam's, or for that matter, my own nostalgia for a bygone era as a moment of relative peace. If we return to the above-mentioned representation of Hassam's childhood, the theme of conflict is poignantly present in the article, as it was written and read in the mid-1990s when Karachi was ridden by intra-ethnic violence, kidnapping, burglaries, and caste matchings. Her historical narrative, as it unfolds into the present, has a serious tone to it. The narrative being a woman, the discussion of contemporary public spaces is more contentious. Even in carefree moments, there is a constant struggle in her rendition as she seeks to maintain a sense of being part of the city and public spaces. Hassam's childhood memories, however, recall a Karachi from a middle-class perspective and maybe a Mahajar perspective, from a period before the explosion in its population in the 60s, when the city started receiving large numbers of working-class migrants from other parts of Pakistan. How the poor survive in their private and work life in Pakistan's expanding cities are stories and histories that are yet to be seriously explored. My intervention today, brief it may not be, but I'll try to cut it short as much as possible, is to understand some of the ways in which the poor experience life in Karachi. In pursuing this goal, I will engage with gender as a category of analysis and follow the social life of working class men and women, which is of course distinct from my own or Hassam's or Azra Abbas's middle class experience, as I've mentioned. I rely on some ethnographic work that I did in a working class neighborhood in Orangi town. I don't know if you all know about it, it's in the northeast of the city. And also take advantage of other kinds of archives, which is popular fiction and poetry, to specifically analyze how working class men and women experience urban space. So the presentation today is a minor attempt to discuss how the poor in Karachi inhabit in the present in a multi-ethnic and economically uncertain urban milieu. So what I'm trying to suggest is that to concentrate on this aspect of Karachi's working life that is not always captured in the predetermined narrative tropes of ethnic conflict, sectarian violence, and elite political power that make the basis of most studies. I want to take a route not to dismiss the importance of other studies, but to make a necessary argument that despite the depiction of conflict based on ethnic identity, politics, religious violence in the literature of Karachi and perhaps Pakistan, people from a variety of background and history may also continue to participate in processes of shared life, intermarry, and cooperate in civic struggles. This is a nice picture of Karachi actually. Karachi के मैप पिक्चर चलिए इसके बाद वाला और उसके बाद हाँ ये बेहतर है. So the idea is that how women and men work toward creating coexistence in public atmosphere charged with ethnic conflict and structural violence. So, of course, I do take my cue from a variety of my own ethnographic work, but also the things that I have shared with you. And again, try to reiterate that the socialist, I'm thinking of a social and political space that may be emblematic of contemporary Pakistan, where a diverse, multilingual, and multi-ethnic population considers the challenges, pitfalls, and compromises of coexistence. The issue is, we keep on talking about Pakistan as a nation and the way in which we are bound together by certain kinds of histories, and so the history of Muslim nationalism, the language of Urdu, and but this has remained constantly the kind of friction in the national myth, right from its very beginning. I mean, Urdu is spoken just by at least till very recently 8 or 10% of as their mother tongue, and right from the beginning, the issue of language and culture was one of the major issues that kept on fracturing the national myth of Muslim nation nationalism, bringing together certain kinds of, for a particular moral community that from Peshawar till Chennai, if you were a Muslim, you were one nation. But that basically myth is constantly challenged, and the creation of Bangladesh, what we are seeing in Balochistan, what we have seen in the northwest frontier province in Sindh, and even in Punjab. These kinds of questions are being constantly raised. Let me introduce this argument and discuss with you a documentary made by the Pakistani filmmaker Sabir Somar about women in Pakistan. In an important scene, Somar, people know Sabir's work? People know Silent Waters, Khamosh Pani? Anyone has seen Khamosh Pani?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Somar contrasts the present public arena where urban women are increasingly donning the veil to that of an era when Pakistan was newly formed. In a voiceover during an autobiographical moment in the film, while showing a home movie to her family, Somar asserts that her mother told her as a child that we are now in Pakistan and we do not need to be veiled. We are all Muslims and the same. The implicit argument being that one wails for strangers. Such remembering of an unveiled Karachi of peaceful coexistence remains a class-specific memory, mostly shared by an elite that had investment in the politics of Muslim nationalism linked to a modern state during the early years of Pakistan's existence. Sabir Somar's father was they owned Muhammad Farooq Textile, the very elite, also part of Pakistan Muslim League. The notion that you don't need to veil in Pakistan because we are all Muslims is a specific kind of imagination, a specific kind of nostalgia of a certain class. Of course, women were veiling then as well and all. However, the subsequent history of Pakistan and its post-colonial period has been one of contestation and conflict around the question of community and class. Somar's childhood memories are also part of a larger middle-class recall of Karachi from a period before the explosion of population in the 60s, when the city started receiving large numbers of working-class men from upcountry. Now, talking about men, let's also talk a little bit about working-class women and their relationship to city life, and to those who are unfamiliar, strangers, those who you wail for. And this unfamiliarity creates its own sets of bodily and emotional disciplining, not always captured by representational films like Somar's. Poor women brave urban public transport without the social protection that class offers elite women. Urban public life in Pakistan for lower class women does not always allow them the pleasures of the modern cinemas, the cafe, parks, concert halls, beaches, or the promenade, which they can enter at their own volition. That's not that women are not working. Your industrial, at least in Karachi, I'm sure in Lahore as well, your industries are full of female workers. You would not be able to survive in middle-class neighborhoods if women did not come to your house and do the domestic chores. There are women doing all kinds of work all the time who are invisible to us. We only think of women as work when we talk about it in certain kinds of environments, but not that they are constantly being present there. And they do not have the pleasure of the kind of ways in which upper or middle class men or women traverse or experience the city. Especially poor women at times offer the options of, for them, the only options that the city life offers is the harassment in narrow alleys of industrial townships, in long waits at bus stops of unpredictable public transport system, and the discriminating work culture that needs to be negotiated due to the compulsion of earning a living. This is not to argue for an insufficient modernity, that we are backward and London is forward kind of thing, or a cultural lag in some teleological sense, and this is a larger theoretical argument that I'm not going to go into. But to explore the context of urban social politics, which is enmeshed in multiplicity of discourses and struggles of the everyday that working class and poor women and men have to encounter. So, I had a brief interlude about infrastructure and theoretically, but I'll skip that. It's basically to take you to other geographies and tell how people, for instance, in post-Soviet Siberia or in Nigeria and other places are sort of trying to tackle the socio-economic downturn in their lives and the removal of infrastructural guarantees. But that's for a different time, because I'm sure I would rather go to some of the ethnographic examples and then conclude. I just want to reiterate though, and this is sort of harping so that what I want to say becomes really clear that there have been arguments by some cultural geographers, and Nigel Thrift is one person who comes to mind, is that there have been recent arguments about societies that are based on shared orders, but are not based on shared orders, but are determined on the coexistence of different worlds. Worlds that cannot be expected to reach agreement as they do not hold shared premises. Linked to this, there has been a falling away from large-scale technocritic and social political projects, whether in their bourgeois or socialist formulations. Not so much for them for negating difference, but for them to unleash forces that their own proponents do not seem to understand. So what I'm trying to suggest is that more and more societies are becoming, in Europe, you're seeing it in the United States, here, that we are living in worlds where we do not have shared ideas about what a good future would be. And sometimes this was sort of reworked through these grand modernist projects, whether in the socialist world or whether in the liberal world, that, if we do X, Y, and Z, then the world would be fine, if we all behave, if we all become socially conscious. But those kinds of projects have already failed. So we're living in a moment where there's a lot of flux and there's a lot of difference that we have not been able to overcome by just grand policy. Surveys show that certain kind of, and I'm borrowing from certain kind of misanthropy or certain kind of dislike, pervades the urban space. Crime, the mistrust of unwelcome others. There is always some kind of rage. There's a daily mutilation and laceration in the urban space, and that is also propagated by media. Just bear with me, I'm just trying to make you think of the urban in a much more general sense, that all the conflicts that are happening are a particular historical moment. Now, the same examples we can give from specific sites like Karachi or Lahore, but I'm just trying to make a general argument here. We are trying to make ourselves better, but the most specific or the pacifying kind of people and rational among us are not immune to certain feelings of outrage, whether we're driving a car, whether we are, right now, 10 minutes ago, and I do apologize to the young women, I was sort of early and things were late, and I had a certain, although I feel that I'm not a very harsh person, but I had to sort of get it out, so I do apologize. So, whoever it is, other people here. So the point is that this is right at the surface. It's right at the surface. In a morally ambiguous manner, we need to start to perhaps understand the historical moment of our existence. Our pleasures seem to be in the sometimes celebration, perhaps, of identity politics, who belongs and who does not, so the issue of difference. Sexuality, unfettered display of aggressive masculinity. And even in our simple everyday conversations, the rude interruptions. So that's what we've become. We, us, they, stranger, or the way we men can sort of strut and do things, which my behavior may have been a part of this, not only hierarchy and authority, but a certain kind of masculinity and certain kind of demand of a certain kind of behavior because of power. And be very open here, and I do apologize, but this is it. This is how we have become, and it's a matter of us training ourselves, but is it just a matter of training ourselves? This moral ambiguity is something we need to deal with. We may not be able to wish it away. Yes, yet cities, I would also suggest, howsoever tentatively may have a large reservoir, yes, they may have enmity, but they may also have a surplus of hope. Now, this is not I'm talking about Clinton and the boy from Hope or Obama's hope, but real, serious hope. The task for us at some level is to create a social environment of kindness and empathy. Not in some kind of replay of middle class more of good manners, like, just sharif ho jao or tamiz se baat karo or khade ho jao jo bade aaye. That's not what I'm trying to say. Rather than think of cities as inherently agonistic and violent, the issue is for us to think of ways of how to create spaces for kindness and compassion in a milieu where things militate against them. New kinds of politics is necessary, new kinds of flora, fauna. a different kind of ways of inhabiting what we call the urban. Where people have a light touch, and here I'm thinking about, they're not so light touch, but infrastructures like metros, right? But then there can also be parks. There can also be different ways in which people come together, and this is what you wanted me to talk about, and I'll come to that. You know, I always think about, and this is also borrowing from Nigel Tripp's work, it made me conscious of the issue of elevators, lifts. You know, we get into elevator, we come out of elevator, it's a crowded elevator, we hardly touch each other, we hardly say each other, but we are very civil. Where does that civility come from? We make space for people, we sit, we suffer the claustrophobia. Maybe it's just transitory. But the way we live that moment, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, depending on which floor you're going, in an elevator, is a way of thinking about unconsciously living together with difference. We're all different, and we may have different kinds of histories and impulses, but we accommodate each other in that tight space. I mean, I'm not saying start getting into elevators and practicing this, but I'm just saying we do it instinctively. So I'm just trying to metaphorically make you all think about these spaces. People rub shoulders unknown to each other, but affectively conscious of each other's presence. This kind of thinking may lead to a common mood as people share common spaces and awareness. Friendship networks, the proliferation. So these are the kinds of things I'm trying to suggest. How much longer do I have? No, not as much. You're very kind. Then I'll just go into this rampage of,
You're all yours.
No, shukriya. Let me give you one brief example and then try to give you some literary examples to close. So, one of the things that I did in Orangi is work with working class men and women, and especially with working class women who were in the garment industry. But I also work with men, and this is some time back, almost 15, 16 years ago, but I've periodically gone back. Things may have changed as well. To understand, let me give an example of some kind of ways in which this neighborhood, like a lot of poor neighborhoods in Karachi then and now, were afflicted with drug addiction amongst the working poor, especially men. So, to understand urban poor men's social situation better, let me introduce you to Hasina Begum. Now, one thing you may not know, the younger generation, till 1980, Pakistan had a drug problem, but there was no heroin. Heroin comes after the Afghan war. And by 1987, there was a research by the Social Work Department of University of Karachi. Almost 47% of the formal industrial workforce in Karachi, male, was in some kind of addiction, and a lot of them on heroin. The statistics by early 1990 was at least 1 to 2% of all working, of the entire population of 1991-92 was on some kind of, was addicted to a hard drug. That's a large number. And so, I mean, some of you know that heroin needs a certain, different kinds of drugs, marijuana and hashish and opium, those don't need, but heroin needs a certain kind of a chemical transformation. And so all wars of this kind, whether the Afghan war or the Vietnam war, were partially funded through these kinds of interventions. Who funds them and how, so these are murky stories. So let me introduce you to Hasina Begum, a garment worker who had raised her son almost single-handedly as her husband had never worked and lately had become an addict. She narrated a recent episode then from her life by telling how her in-laws had collected some money and leased a taxi for her husband to drive. He, however, never helped financially in the domestic budget. Rather, he started maintaining his habit on the side by selling the taxi's spare parts. Then he vanished for a couple of weeks. Her son, while traveling on a bus, saw his father lying unconscious on the side of the road and brought him home. The husband was nursed back to health and was fine for a few days, but then the violence and abuse started again. Her dilemma is that she cannot throw him out of the house, as that would be shameful and her son would lose his father. On the one hand, living with a man, according to her, had become unbearable. On the other, she felt responsible for his well-being and continued to care for him in her capacity as a dutiful wife. As much as we would empathize with her predicament of raising her son without any familial or spousal support in a precarious social, economic, and cultural environment for women workers, we need to also understand the sheer hopelessness of men, such as her husband, who are left to die on the roadside every day. So it's not a, it's a grey story. Most men, of course, experience the city with a far more comfort and sense of freedom than women we met in our work ever would. They traverse the public sphere without the same kind of bodily discipline and emotional restraint that women have to endure. And this goes for middle class, upper class women as well. So the contrast between male and female experience can also be brought forward by giving an example of Ananya Roy's work on Calcutta, where she looks at commuters who enter the lowest end of Calcutta's labor sector. Speaking of gendered element in the urban experience, Roy, who's at Berkeley, shows how the issues of sexual freedoms, moral economies, domestic responsibilities, work processes, and labor segmentation operate in such instances. Where men can constitute themselves bathing in the crowds of the city, working women's mobility is constrained by moral discussions about their sexuality, domestic responsibilities, and potential of corrupting the public space by their presence, which happens every day to women in this country as well. Yet Roy, in the same body of work, also depicts the vulnerability of male work in the contemporary moment. This connects to the above discussed example of the unemployed, exhausted, and wasted body of Hasina Begum's husband. Roy makes an argument about how poor women during her fieldwork depicted their husband as dead while they were alive. So these women would commute from the suburbs of Calcutta and do menial work or sell on the street, and they would constantly tell her that husband were dead, which they were not. But in order to furnish us with a critique of male abandonment and polygamy, but also to sensitize us to men's withdrawal from the labor force due to layoffs, injuries, or old age. And similarly, Hasina Begum had a critique of her husband's abandonment of his duties as a spouse, yet was also sensitive to her role as a wife, in the process making us further aware how male absence, addiction, or chronic unemployment contribute to destabilize domestic life. So this is sort of the kind of way I'm trying to think through gender difference, violence, and the way in which men and women in contemporary Pakistan or Karachi actually are sort of addressing the issue of structural violence, of economic deprivation, of layoffs, and yet also of household effects of these kinds of. Women experience physical and emotional threat in places like Orangi. Their experience demands attention and consideration and sensitivity. The proliferation of social phenomena of fear linked to risk women face when leaving their homes and entering public populated by strangers and others also needs our comment as an aspect of contemporary human condition. In addition to the invocation of fear, women also spoke to us about the desire to visit the cinema, go to parks, and visit cafes by themselves and question the unequal standard of social life that they had to comply with. This is one side of it. The other part is I also conducted fieldwork of group of activists mentioned above, the group of activists in their neighborhoods to organize women from various communities against the bus operators so that they would be able to stop for women during rush hours. The activists were linked to labor groups in Karachi and mostly lived in the same area. They themselves belonged to various ethnicities and either themselves previously worked in garment industry or had close family members associated with it. Through their work and local contacts, they had access to the various households and started a campaign that led to small demonstrations to protest against what they considered the high-handedness of transporters and also the collusion of the police and local authorities against not accommodating women passengers. In Lahore is slightly better. In Karachi, even 70 years after independence and the exponential growth of women going to various kinds of workspaces and universities and colleges, the space for women in the bus has remained the same. And invariably, the buses don't, even give those spaces to men. So there's all this sort of politics around transportation. Standing by the roadside in various ethnically marked dresses and communicating in a range of accents, these women's actions showed how despite disagreements and even rivalries, people come together at a particular junction of the busy and difficult life. So at one level, I tried to, with this example of Hasina Begum, show these sort of ways in which life within the household happens in precarious socio-economic situations. And on the other hand, I'm trying to look at some of the tensions in the larger work between various ethnicities that are invariably sort of depicted as violent against each other, coming together around certain kinds of civic action. Such realities are shared and experienced by urban women who grow up on the proverbial other side of the tracks in Pakistan. In many cases, women we interviewed, who were mostly Mahajir but not exclusively, were married to men from other ethnicities due to their father's friendship and their father-in-laws, or their father-in-law, or with their father-in-laws, the father's friendship with their father-in-laws, or had neighbors who proposed to their families for their hand. Several cases, Mahajir women were married to Pashtun men because their respective fathers were involved in the same Islamic religious movement. In one case, a woman who had lived in a village in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, now NWFB then, with her husband for several years before returning to Karachi with her husband. So, people from different ethnicities live and work in close proximities, and possibility of romance and marriage by choice with a person in the neighborhood or at work for a younger generation of women is a lived reality, along with neighborhood proximity and similar class position, religious affiliations at times overcame ethnic difference. What I'm trying to suggest is that with all the issues of violence and Pashtun, Mahajir, and all kinds of language we use, things happen constantly, and people sort of create linkages, either they are neighbors and they find they're attracted to people from quote-unquote the strangers that we bail for, and or we either do things together in terms of creating possibilities of contingent of actions in civic action or a certain kind of a micropolitics in which ethnicity is overcome by other kinds of concerns, perhaps class, perhaps religious affiliation. So what I'm trying to suggest is that rather than have these kinds of larger ideas and stereotypes about this is representing all these kinds of processes in some kind of a broad sense of, these are all kind of projects that need a certain kind of solutions based on our understanding of what urban life is, we have to go down to the literally in people's life and really see how their lives inform us about how things can change or not, or are already changing. So after living and working in spaces like Orangi, where there are distinct possibilities of people falling in love with the wrong ethnicity or having a heritage which is more similar than is acknowledged, it became clear to us that there is always a somewhere else, an outside, beyond the modalities of organized attempts to help the poor and the vulnerable. The idea here is not to criticize the effort and enthusiasm of young activists who organize workshops or other such meaningful activities, nor is it to undermine the social reality of conflict and ethnic violence in neighborhoods, in such neighborhoods in large cities like Karachi. But men and women in the communities they lived in continue to create relationships between bodies, spaces, science, infrastructure, to connect and with various ways of life and different social actors. So Hasina Begum's critique, to take the above mentioned example of her husband's action, was intertwined with an empathetic gesture towards his condition. Although unequal gender relations in these households is a given, yet rarely we question how it is maintained, perpetuated, or changed in linkage to the social changes in society. Despite conflict, hence, there still remains a space of mutual dependence and caring within these families. These contradictory desires and understanding of the social may also mark what some theorists have called the intimacy of daily life, where people may be ambivalent about the problems they face and want things to remain the same, or they do not seek or to make them into an issue that they want to solve through formal intervention. So I'm not saying that domestic violence, I'm not condoning domestic violence, I'm not condoning the behavior of Hasina Begum's husband. I'm not even saying that the way that women are experiencing the urban is something that we should take for granted. We need to change it, but I'm also saying that there are other stories embedded in these stories. And not everything is an issue that needs intervention. So, now I'm finally coming to the नीचे चलिएगा और चलते रहिए बिल्कुल आखिर में चलिए आखिर में भाई बिल्कुल आखिर में चलिए बस ये इससे पहले वाले जी So what are the possibilities for contemporary Karachi in which a diverse multilingual ethnic problem considers the challenges, pitfalls and compromises of coexistence? To understand this process of living with disagreement, let me share with you excerpts of a poem by the poet Haris Khalid. The poem is called Muzammil the Watchmaker. So I've put the translation up there so that if people don't understand. Is there anyone who doesn't understand Urdu?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Yes, sir? You don't understand Urdu?
Understand.
Okay.
Better understanding.
You'd rather read it in English or in Urdu?
Urdu.
ये तो मैं कह रहा हूँ आपसे
ये हमारे जैसे ही है
ये भी हमारे जैसे निकले It's an excerpt from a larger poem, मुजम्मल घड़ी सास. अम्मा अब्बा मुजम्मल को अख्तर भी कहते थे. अरे अख्तरू, हम हैं इचप जाई, ईसप जाई. ये बिहारी में यूसुफ जाई को कहते हैं. यूसुफ जाई को कहते हैं. मैं भी बिहारी हूँ, यूसुफ जाई की जगह ईसप जाई कहता हूँ. गांव में अल्लाह बख्शे, पठानों की बस्ती में सबसे बड़े तेरे नाना मियाँ थे. मेरे सिंध के बेनवा सरजमी में अपनी आंखों में आगोश इमादत की गर्मी लिए खून रोती रही. आगे चलिए. खून रोती रही फसादों की इस बार जो बाढ़ आई, पठान और बिहारी लड़े. कत्ल और गारत का बाजार यूं गर्म था, बाकी बाजार खाली हुए, कर्फ्यू लग गया. कर्फ्यू जब ना होता तो हड़ताल होती. किसी का गुजर नहीं था, सभी तंग थे. तब दुकानें खुली और मुजम्मिल घड़ी साज ने अपना कैबिन वली भाई रंगरेज के कारखाने से बाहर निकाला तो कुछ सहमे से गाहक भी आने लगे. फिर से हमला हुआ, गोलियां तड़तड़ा के चली, खून रुकता नहीं था. मुजम्मल घड़ी साज की कोख पूरी हुई. उसने एक आखिरी चीख मारी, अरे खान लाला, पठनवा को मारा. अरे हम तो ईसब जई थे. Haris Khalid's important poem captures the ambiguity of identities in present-day Karachi. The poem was written as a tribute to a short story by Urdu man of letters Asad Muhammad Khan. The short story, My Dada, is about a retainer in a Muslim household who is respected as one of the family. Yet after his death, one finds out that he was actually a Hindu. As the story ends in a climax, so does the poem. Both force us to question the fixity of identity and allow us the space to imagine the possibilities of worlds where those we consider our enemies are actually part of us in profound and meaningful ways. Let me say this, those we consider our enemies are actually part of us in profound and meaningful ways. Pathanwa tumhara, Pathan humara, maybe Yusuf Jai hu, right? This poem nudges us towards imagining a potential space, a possibility of sorts of cooperation and mutual support for people of different ethnic backgrounds who seek to share common destinies. This does not mean that all problems are solved or there has to be blind optimism, but it directs us towards a politics of hope, a spirit of coexistence where disagreements can be lived with without general gesture, within a general gesture of kindness and tacit concurrence with others about how to get by. Let me finally go back to Azra Abbas. You remember Azra Abbas? So, Azra Abbas' memoir that I discussed in the beginning of this talk, she keeps on reminding us how as a child, the differential treatment of her sisters and brothers by her mother made her upset. After seeing her mother routinely give boys milk for breakfast and tea to the girls, Abbas one day takes the milk cup, spilling the milk right in front of her mother and runs away to school. She's still very, very naughty. I mean, she's amazing. Another memory is about her being repeatedly asked to wear the dupatta by her father and brothers. Abbas took all the dupattas in the house and threw them outside in the garbage. And yet another time she left without asking anyone with her elder brother's friends so that she would watch them play carom till it was dark outside. Such acts are present throughout the text and show how despite being forced to comply and behave, Abbas did not conform. Abbas' childhood in her biographical piece is not about looking good or playing dumb. Abbas was not invisible then or now, and her book burns with anger. Let us all hope, like Abbas, we see a future where girls can still play outside in the road, ride bicycles, and fly kite without fear. Thank you. I apologize for the length, but there's no questions, hopefully.
If there are any questions,
I know there will be one, but I won't take this.
जी तौसीफ साहब
सर ये हसीना बेगम की कहानी कहाँ लिखी हुई है और इसको अफसाने की सूरत में असद मोहम्मद खान जैसे शाहकार बनाया है किसी ने इस
नहीं, कहाँ लिखी है? मेरे एथनोग्राफिक डिटेल है, कहीं लिखी कहानी नहीं है, ये मेरा इंटरव्यू है हसीना बेगम से।
तो असद मोहम्मद खान जैसे अफसाना निगारों ने इसको कहीं शाहकार बनाया हो?
मेरा तो नहीं अंदाजा, मैं तो हिसाब से वाकिफ नहीं था, उनकी कहानियों से वाकिफ, लेकिन ये कि हम लोग भी कहानी इकट्ठे करते हैं एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट के तौर पे, और ये कहीं काफियों में और हमारे रद्दी खाने में ये पड़ी रहती हैं, और ये ताकि थोड़ी बहुत उनकी झलकियाँ आप लोग को मिल जाती हैं, नहीं कहीं ऐसी कहानी जो कुछ है ये मैंने लिखा है।
थैंक यू।
शुक्रिया।
थैंक यू।